So I'm dyslexic as fuck. So I was thinking that if I actually read out loud, it might help me with learning to not move things around so much because I'm going to have to focus. So I'm going to try it. So I'm reading this one. So again, I've already read it because it's a really good book. First of all, if you haven't read Six of Crows, you should. And it's only a duology, so there's only two. But the reason I'm reading it again is because I just bought this one. Why is it so shiny? King of Scars. So this one is about Nina, and you meet Nina in this one. And it's also about the other two who are from the other Grisha series, but the other one is written in first person, and I don't like that. So, you know. But I'm going to read this one. But I'm like, oh shit, it's been so long since I read this one. Honestly, it hasn't even been that long. It's only been like 2 years or something. But my brain is broken. So it is what it is. So I was like, okay. So I was like, you know what? I've been meaning to reread this one anyway. So I'm like, let me just read it. Now, I forgotten how to read. So, and I don't know how to pronounce things ever. So I'm going to sound like a stupid ass. And that's okay because I'm doing it to practice. So it's fine. It's not like anybody's going to watch this fucking anyway. That's right. And I don't know how to pronounce things. So this is like all of my pronunciations are going to be fucking wrong. But I don't care. Anyway, so I'm going to start. Story time. All right. Just had two problems, the moon and his mustache. He was supposed to be making his rounds at the Hoyd house, but for the last 15 minutes he'd been hovering around the southeast wall of the gardens, trying to think of something clever and romantic to say to Anya. If only Anya's eyes were blue like the sea, or green like an emerald. Instead, her eyes were brown, lovely, dreamy, melted chocolate brown? Rabbit fur brown? Just tell her she's got skin like moonlight, his friend Peter had said. Girls love that. A perfect solution, but the Ketterdam weather was not cooperating. There'd been no breeze off the harbor that day, and the gray milk fog had wreathed the city's canals and crooked alleys in damp. Even here among the mansions of the Geldstraat, the air hung thick with the smell of fish and bilge water, and smoke from the refineries of the city's outer islands had smeared the night sky in a briny haze. The full moon looked less like a jewel than the yellowy blister in need of lancing. See, I told you. Maybe he could compliment Anya's laugh, except he'd never heard her laugh. He wasn't very good with jokes. Juice glanced at the reflection in one of the glass panels set in the double doors that led from the house to the side garden. His mother was right. Even in his new uniform, he still looked like a baby. Gently, he brushed his finger along his upper lip. It was only his mustache would come in. It definitely felt thicker than yesterday. He'd been a guard in the Stadwatch less than 6 weeks, and it wasn't nearly as exciting as he'd hoped. He thought he'd be running down thieves in the barrel or patrolling the harbors, getting first look at cargo comings in on the dock. But ever since the assassinations on the ambassador at the town hall, the merchant council had been grumbling about security. So where was he? Stuck walking circles at some lucky mercher's house. Not just any mercher, though. Councilman Hoyd was about as high-placed in Ketterdam government as any man could be. The kind of man who could make a career. Just adjusted the setting on his coat and rifle, then patted the weighted baton at his hip. Maybe Hoyd could take a liking to him. Sharp eye and quick wit with the cudgel. Hoyd would say, that fellow deserved a promotion. Sergeant Joost Van Pol, he whispered, savoring the sound of his words. Captain Joost Van Pol. Stop gawking at yourself. Joost whirled, cheeks going hot as Henk and Rutger strode into the side garden. They were both older, bigger, and broader of shoulder than Joost, and they were house guards, private servants of Councilman Hoyd. That meant they wore his pale green livery, carried fancy rifles from Neuve Zem, and never let Joost forget he was a lowly grunt from the city watch. Petting that bit of fuzz isn't going to make it grow any faster, Rutger said with a loud laugh. Joost tried to summon some dignity. I need to finish my rounds. Rutger elbowed Henk. That means he's going to go stick his head in the Grisha workshop to get a look at his girl. Oh, Anya, won't you please use your Grisha magic to make my mustache grow? Henk mocked. Joost turned on his heel, cheeks burning, and strode down the eastern side of the house. They'd been teasing him ever since he'd arrived. If he hadn't been for Anya, he probably would have pleaded with his captain for a reassignment. He and Anya only ever exchanged a few words on his round, but she was always the best part of his night. And he had to admit, he liked Hoyd's house too. The few peeks he'd managed through the windows, Hoyd had one of the grandest mansions of the Geldstraat, floors set with gleaming squares of black and white stone, shining dark wood walls lit with blown glass chandeliers that floated like jellyfish near the coifred ceilings. Sometimes Juice liked to pretend that it was his house and that he was a rich merchant just out for a stroll through his fine garden. Before he rounded the corner, Juice took a deep breath. Anya, your eyes are brown like tree bark? He'd think of something. He was better off being spontaneous anyway. He was surprised to see the glass panel doors to the Grisha workshop open, more than the hand-painted blue tiles in the kitchen or the mantle laden with potted tulips. This workshop was a testimony to Hoyd's wealth. Grisha indentures didn't come cheap, and Hoyd had 3 of them. But Yuri wasn't seated at the long work table, and Anya was nowhere to be seen. Only Retvinko was there, sprawled out on the chair in the dark blue robes, eyes shut, and a book open on his chest. Juice hovered in the doorway, then cleared his throat. These doors should be shut and locked at night. House is like furnace, Retvinko drawled without opening his eyes, his Vravkin accent thick and rolling. Tell Hoyd I stopped sweating. I closed doors. Retvinko was a squaller, older than the other Grisha indentures, his hair shot through with silver. There were rumors he'd fought for the losing side in the Ravka Civil War, and he had fled to Kerch after the fighting. I'd be happy to present your complaints to the councilman, Hoyd, Juice lied. The house was always overheated, as if Hoyd was under some obligation to burn coal, but Juice wasn't going to be the one to mention it. Until then, you bring news of Yuri? Retvinko interrupted, finally opening his heavily hooded eyes. Juice glanced uneasily at the bowls of red grapes and the heaps of burgundy velvet on the work table. Yuri had been working on bleeding color from the fruit into curtains for Mistress Hoyd, but he'd fallen badly ill a few days ago, and Juice hadn't seen him since. Dust had begun to gather on the velvet, and the grapes were going bad. I haven't heard anything. Of course you hear nothing. Too busy strutting around in stupid purple uniform. What was wrong with his uniform? Why did Retvinko even have to be here? He was Hoyd's personal squaller and often traveled with the merchant's most precious cargoes, guaranteeing favorable winds to bring the ship safely and quickly to harbor. Why couldn't he be away at sea now? I think Yuri may have been quarantined. So helpful, Retvinko said with a sneer. You can stop craning neck like hopeful goose. Anya is gone. Juice felt his heart race again. Where is she? He asked, trying to sound authoritative. She should be in after dark. 1 hour ago, Hoyd take her, same as night he came for Yuri. What do you mean he came for Yuri? Yuri fell ill. Hoyd comes for Yuri. Yuri come back. 2 days later, Yuri vanished for good. Now Anya. For good? Maybe there was an emergency. If someone needed to be healed, first Yuri, now Anya. I will be next, and no one will notice except poor little Officer Juiced. Go now. If Councilman Hoyd... Retvinko raised an arm and a gust of air slammed Juice backwards. Juice scrambled to keep his footing, grabbing at the doorframe. I said now! Retvinko etched a circle in the air, and the door slammed shut. Juice let go just in time to avoid having his fingers smashed and toppled into the side gardens. He got to his feet as quickly as he could, wiping muck from his uniform, shame squirming in his belly. One of the glass panes in the door had cracked from the force. Through it, he saw the squaller smirking. That's counting against your indenture, Juice said, pointing to the ruined pane. He hated how small and petty his voice sounded. Retvinko waved his hand, and the doors trembled on his hinges. Without meaning to, Juice took a step back. Go and make your rounds, little watchdog, Retvinko called. That went well, snickered Rutger, leaning against the garden wall. How long had he been standing there? Don't you have something better to do than to follow me around? Juice asked. All guards are to report to the boathouse, even you. Or are you too busy making friends? I was asking him to shut the door. Rutger shook his head. You don't ask, you tell. They're servants, not honored guests. Juice fell in a step beside him, inside still churning with humiliation. The worst part was that Rutger was right. Retvinko had no business talking to him that way. But what was Juice supposed to do? Even if he'd had the courage to step into a fight with a squaller, it would be like brawling with an expensive vase. The Grisha weren't just servants. They were Hoyd's treasured possessions. What had Retvinko mean when he said that Anya and Yuri had been taken away? Had he been covering for Anya? Grisha indentures were kept in the house for good reason. To walk the streets without protection was to risk getting plucked up by a slaver and never seen again. Maybe she's meeting someone, Juice speculated miserably. His thoughts were interrupted by the blaze of light and activity down by the boathouse that faced the canal. Across the water, he could see the fine merchant houses, tall and slender, the tidy gables of their rooftops making a dark silhouette against the night sky, their gardens and boathouses lit by glowing lanterns. A few weeks before, Juice had been told that Hoyd's boathouse would be undergoing improvements and to strike it from his rounds. But when he and Rutger entered, he saw no painting or scaffolding. The gondolas and oars had been pushed up against the walls. The other house guards were there in their sea-green livery, and Juice recognized 2 Stadwatch guards in purple. But most of the interior was taken up by a huge box, a kind of freestanding cell that looked as if it was made from reinforced steel. It seemed thick with rivets, a huge window embedded in one of its walls. The glass had a wavy bent, and through it, Juiced could see a girl seated at a table, clutching her red silks tight around her. Behind her, a Stadwatch guard stood at attention. Anya! Juiced realized with a start. Her brown eyes were wide and frightened, her skin pale. The little boy seated across from her looked doubly terrified. His hair was sleep-tousled, and his legs dangling from the chair, kicking nervously at the air. Why all the guards? Asked Juiced. There had to be more than 10 of them crowded into the boathouse. Councilman Hoyd was there too, along with another merchant Juiced didn't know, both of them dressed in merchant black. Juiced stood up straighter when he saw that they were walking to the captain of the Stadwatch. He'd hoped he'd gotten all the garden mud off of his uniform. What is this? Rutger shrugged. Who cares? It's a break in the routine. Juiced looked back through the glass. Anya was staring out at him, her gaze unfocused. The day he'd arrived at Hoyd House, she'd healed a bruise on his cheek. It had been nothing, the yellow-green remnants of a crack he'd taken to the face during a training exercise, but apparently Hoyd had caught sight of it and didn't like his guards looking like thugs. Juiced had been sent to the Grisha workshop, and Anya had sat him down in a bright square of late winter sunlight. Her cool fingers had passed over his skin, and through the itch had been terrible. Bare seconds later, it was as if the bruise had never been. When Juiced thanked her, Anya had smiled, and Juiced was lost. He knew his cause was hopeless. Even if she'd had any interest in him, he could never afford to buy her indenture from Hoyd, and she would never marry unless Hoyd decreed it. But it hadn't stopped him from dropping by to say hello or to bring her little gifts. She'd liked the map of Kerch best, a whimsical drawing of their island nation, surrounded by mermaids swimming in the true sea, and ships blown along by the wind, depicted by fat-cheeked men. It was a cheap souvenir, the kind tourists brought along East Stave, but it had seemed to please her. Now he risked raising a hand in greeting. Anya showed no reaction. She can't see, you moron, laughed Rutger. The glass is mirrored on the other side. Juiced's cheeks pinked. How was I to know that? Open your eyes and pay attention for once. First jury, now Anya. Why do they need a Grisha healer? Is that boy injured? He looks fine to me. The captain and Hoyd seemed to reach some kind of agreement. Through the glass, Juiced saw Hoyd enter the cell and give the boy an encouraging pat. There must have been vents in the cell because he heard Hoyd say, Be a brave lad, and there's a few krug in it for you. Then he grabbed Anya's chin with a silver-spotted hand. She tensed, and Juiced's gut tightened. Hoyd gave Anya's head a little shake. Do as you're told, and this will soon be over, yeah? She gave a small, tight smile. Of course, uncle. Hoyd whispered a few words to the guard behind Anya, then stepped out. The door shut with a loud clang, and Hoyd slid a heavy lock into place. Hoyd and the other merchant took positions almost directly in front of Juiced and Rutger. Jesus Christ. The merchant Juiced didn't know said, You're sure this is wise? This girl is a Oh, fuck this word. Corporalumnik. After what happened to your fabricator, if it was Retvinko, I'd be worried, but Anya was a sweet disposition. She's a healer, not prone to aggression. And you've lowered the dosage? Yes, but we've agreed that if we have the same result as the fabricator, the council will compensate me. I can't be asked to bear the expense. When the merchant nodded, Hoyd signaled to the captain. Proceed. The same results as the fabricator. Retvinko claimed Yuri had vanished. What was that? Is that what he meant? Sergeant, said the captain. Are you ready? The guard inside the cell replied, Yes, sir. He drew a knife. Joyce swallowed hard. First test, the captain said. The guard bent forward and told the boy to roll up his sleeve. The boy obeyed and stuck out his arm, propping the thumb of his other hand in his mouth. Too old for that, thought Juiced, but the boy must be very scared. Juiced had slept with a sock bear until he'd been nearly 14, a fact his older brothers had mocked mercilessly. This will sting just a bit, said the guard. The boy kept his thumb in his mouth and nodded, eyes round. This really isn't necessary, said Anya. Quiet, please, said Hoyd. The guard gave the boy a pat and slashed a bright red cut across his forearm. The boy started crying immediately. Anya tried to raise from the chair, but the guard placed a stern hand on her shoulder. It's all right, Sergeant. Let her heal him, said Hoyd. Anya leaned forward, taking the boy's hand gently. Shh, she said softly. Let me help. Will it hurt? The boy gulped. She smiled. Not at all. Just a little itch. Try to hold still for me. Juiced found himself leaning closer. He'd never actually seen Anya heal someone. Anya removed a handkerchief from her sleeve and wiped away the excess blood. Then her fingers brushed carefully over the boy's wounds. Juiced watched in astonishment as the skin slowly seemed to reform and knit together. A few minutes later, the boy grinned and held out his arm. It looked a bit red, but was otherwise smooth and unmarked. Was that magic? Anya tapped him on the nose. Of a sort. The same magic your own body works when given time and a bit of bandage. The boy looked up, almost disappointed. Good, good, Hoyd said impatiently. Now the param. Just frowned. He'd never heard that word. The captain signaled to his sergeant. Second sequence. Put out your arm, the sergeant said to the boy once again. The boy shook his head. I don't like that part. Do it. The boy's lower lip quivered, but he put out his arm. The guard cut him once more. Then he placed a small wax paper envelope on the table in front of Anya. Swallow the contents of the packet, Hoyd instructed Anya. What is it? She asked, the voice trembling. That isn't your concern. What is it? She repeated. It's not going to kill you. We're going to ask you to perform some simple tasks and judge the drug's effects. This sergeant is there to make sure you only do what you're told and no more. Understood? Her jaw set, but she nodded. No one will harm you, said Hoyd. But remember, if you hurt the sergeant, you have no way out of that cell. The doors are locked from the outside. What is that stuff? Whispered Joost. Don't know, said Rutger. What do you know? He muttered. Enough to keep my trap shut. Joost scowled. With shaking hands, Anya lifted the little wax envelope and opened the flap. Go on, said Hoyd. She tipped her head back and swallowed the powder. For a moment she sat, waited, her lips pressed together. Is it just Gerda? She asked hopefully. Joost found himself hoping too. Gerda was nothing to fear, a stimulant everyone in the Stadwatch chewed to stay awake on late watches. What does it taste like? Hoyd asked. Like Gerda, but sweeter. Anya inhaled sharply. Her hands seized the table, her pupils dilated enough that her eyes looked nearly black. Oh, she said, sighing. It was nearly a purr. The guard tightened his grip on her shoulder. How do you feel? She stared at the mirror and smiled. Her tongue peeked through her white teeth, stained like rust. Joost felt suddenly cold. Just as it was with the fabricator, murmured the merchant. Heal the boy, Hoyd commanded. She waved her hand through the air, the gesture almost dismissive, and the cut on the boy's arm sealed instantly. The blood lifted briefly from his skin, and droplets of red then vanished. His skin looked perfectly smooth, all traces of blood or redness gone. The boy beamed. That was definitely magic. It feels like magic, Anya said with the same eerie smile. She didn't touch him, marveled the captain. Anya, said Hoyd, listen closely. We're going to tell the guard to perform the next test now. Mm-hmm, hummed Anya. Sergeant, said Hoyd, cut off the boy's thumb. The boy howled and started to cry again. He shoved his hands beneath his legs to protect them. I should stop this, Joost thought. I should find a way to protect her, both of them. But what then? He was a nobody, new to the Stadwatch, new to this house. Besides, he discovered in a burst of shame, I want to keep my job. Anya merely smiled and tilted her head back so that she was looking at the sergeant. Shoot the glass. What did she say? Asked the merchant. Sergeant! The captain barked out. Shoot the glass, Anya repeated. The sergeant's face went slack. He crooked his head to the side, as if listening to a distant melody, then unslung his rifle and aimed it at the observant window. Get down! Someone yelled. Joost threw himself to the ground, covered his head as a rapid hammer of gunfire filled his ears and bits of glass rained down on his hands and back. His thoughts were a panic clamor. His mind tried to deny it, but he knew what he'd just seen. Anya had commanded the sergeant to shoot the glass. She'd made him do it. But that couldn't be. Grisha Korporalki specialized in the human body. They could stop your heart, slow your breathing, snap your bones. But they couldn't get inside your head. For a moment there was silence. Then Joost was on his feet with everyone else, reaching for his rifle. Hoyd and the captain shouted at the same time, Subdue her! Shoot her! Do you know how much money she's worth? Hoyd reported, Someone restrain her! Do not shoot! Anya raised her hand, red sleeve spread wide. Wait! She said. Joost, panic, vanished. He knew he'd been frightened, but his fear was a distant thing. He was filled with expectation. He wasn't sure what was coming or when, only that it would arrive, and it was essential that he'd be ready to meet it. It might be good or bad. He didn't really care. His heart was free of worry and desire. He longed for nothing, wanted for nothing. His mind silent, his breath steady. He only needed to wait. He saw Anya raise and pick up the little boy. He heard her crooning tenderly to him, some Ravkin lullaby. Open the door and come in, Hoyd, she said. Joost heard the words, understood them, forgot them. Hoyd walked to the door and slid the bolt free. He entered the steel cell. Do as you're told, and this will be over soon, yeah? Anya murmured with a smile. Her eyes were black and bottomless pools. Her skin was a light, glowing, incandescent. A thought flickered through Joost's mind. Beautiful as the moon. Anya picked up the boy's weight in her arms. Don't look, she murmured against his hair. Now, she said to Hoyd, pick up the knife. All right. So that took me 20 minutes, but that's chapter 1. Huzzah for me. I stumbled a lot, but you know what? It's fine. It's not too bad. I did better than I thought I was going to do, honestly. So, huzzah!